Alcatraz was supposed to be the end of the line. It was the place where America sent the men it couldn't control, men who had tried to break free from every other prison. Frank Morris, along with brothers John and Clarence Anglin, were not supposed to outsmart the Rock. Yet on a cold June night in 1962, they vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only dummy heads in their bunks and a trail of silence. For decades the world has wondered, did they drown in the bay, or did they live in the shadows? The fortress that wasn't. When Alcatraz became a federal prison in 1934, it was designed to crush every hope of escape. Located 1.25 miles off the coast of San Francisco, surrounded by icy currents and unpredictable tides, it carried a reputation as America's most secure penitentiary. Prisoners were locked inside tiny cells built of tool-proof steel, counted up to 13 times a day, and watched by armed guards stationed in elevated gun galleries. Tear gas canisters lined the ceilings, and metal detectors kept the cell blocks under constant control. For nearly 3 decades, the message was clear: no one leaves the Rock. The prison was meant for the men other institutions couldn't handle. Al Capone had been caged there, as had George Machine Gun Kelly. The worst offenders were sent to D Block, home to the Hole, a row of isolation cells that broke men down mentally and physically. Alcatraz was never about rehabilitation. It was about punishment, a stark reminder that certain men were beyond saving. Yet even before the famous escape, cracks were showing. Saltwater corrosion was eating away at the buildings, and the Bureau of Prisons struggled to keep staff on the island. By the early 1960s, Warden Olin Blackwell admitted that it would take $5 million, over $50 million today, to repair the prison. Maintenance was neglected, and prisoners noticed the decay. That weakness would become the very opening that Morris and the Anglin brothers needed. Frank Morris, the mastermind. Frank Lee Morris was no ordinary inmate. Born in 1926, orphaned by the age of 11 and convicted by 13, he grew up moving between foster homes and institutions. His childhood was marked not by stability, but by survival, and that survival sharpened him into a man who could see weaknesses others ignored. With an IQ reportedly around 133, Morris had both the brains and the nerve to attempt what others thought was impossible. By the time he arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960, Morris already had a history of escapes. He had fled from the Louisiana State Penitentiary, evading capture long enough to be considered a serious flight risk. That reputation is what sent him to the Rock. But instead of being broken by its routines, he immediately began to think about how to leave. His intelligence made him a natural leader, and it wasn't long before he found the allies he needed. In neighboring cells were John and Clarence Anglin, brothers from rural Georgia, who had been locked up for a string of burglaries and a bank robbery. Like Morris, they had already tried to break out of other prisons, including a failed attempt at Leavenworth, where Clarence had hidden in a bread box. Their creativity impressed guards, but it also marked them as troublemakers. When fate placed them next to Morris, a plan slowly began to form. The Anglins had loyalty, courage, and practical skills, while Morris brought organization and engineering. With them was Allen West, another inmate who had known Morris from previous stints behind bars. Together, the 4 men formed an unlikely team. They were not hardened killers seeking glory. They were desperate men who refused to accept a life sentence on a decaying island. Morris gave them direction, and in turn, they gave him the manpower to turn imagination into reality. Digging to freedom, tools, illusions, and the raft. The escape from Alcatraz was not born overnight. It took patience, creativity, and a willingness to risk everything. Starting in December 1961, Morris and the Anglin brothers began to carve their way out, exploiting the prison's very decay. Behind the sinks in their cells, the concrete had been weakened by years of saltwater erosion. Using stolen spoons, discarded saw blades, and even a drill made from a vacuum cleaner motor, they chipped away at the walls night after night. The sound of scraping and drilling could have given them away, but Morris was careful. During music hour, he played his accordion loudly, masking the noise with wheezing notes. To cover the growing holes, the men created false vent grills from cardboard and paint, blending them perfectly into the walls. Guards peeking into the cells saw nothing unusual, unaware that a tunnel was slowly opening behind the scenes. Once through the wall, the men could slip into a utility corridor, climb up pipes, and access a hidden workshop on an upper level of the prison. There, they prepared the equipment that would carry them into legend. Over 50 raincoats were stitched and glued together, their seams sealed with hot steam pipes to create a 6x14-foot raft and makeshift life jackets. Even their paddles were homemade, carved from bits of plywood taken from work areas. But the most haunting part of the plan was the deception they left behind. To fool the guards during bed checks, the men sculpted dummy heads out of soap, cement dust, and toilet paper, painting them with stolen supplies and topping them with real hair from the prison barber shop. From a distance, the grotesque figures looked like sleeping men. Clothes and towels stuffed under the blankets gave the impression of bodies beneath the covers. When the night guards glanced into the cells, nothing seemed out of place. By June 1962, every detail was in place. Holes punched out, raft and life jackets hidden, dummy heads ready to stare blankly into the night. The men had transformed Alcatraz itself into a stage set for the most daring performance the prison had ever seen. The night of June 11, 1962, silence and disappearance. On the evening of June 11, 1962, the prison routine unfolded as usual. Guards made their rounds, prisoners were locked in, and the rock seemed as impenetrable as ever. But in 3 cells, behind carefully camouflaged vent covers, the plan was about to reach its climax. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin each slipped through the holes they had carved over months of labor. Their dummies lay silently on the pillows, fooling the watchful eyes of the night guards. Alan West, the 4th member of the group, was less fortunate. His tunnel was still too narrow. He chipped desperately at the last bit of concrete, but the stubborn wall refused to give way. Trapped by inches, he listened as the others crawled into the dark corridor without him. When dawn came, he would still be there, left behind with the bitter taste of failure, forced to tell investigators the story of how close they had come. Meanwhile, Morris and the Anglins climbed 30 feet up a utility shaft, pried open a ventilation cover, and sealed it again with a fake bolt. From there, they reached the roof, crossed the prison grounds, and descended a chimney pipe to scale the fences. By the time they reached the shoreline, the night was still, the fog heavy over San Francisco Bay. At the edge of the island, the men inflated their raincoat raft with the concertina pump they had built. Every stitch and seam, every makeshift paddle was tested under the cover of darkness. Then, without fanfare, they launched into the black water. The bay was frigid, with temperatures between 50 and 55 degrees, and currents that could drag a man under in minutes. To most, it would have been suicide. But to Morris and the Anglins, it was the only chance they had left. When morning came on June 12th, Alcatraz awoke to shock. The dummies still lay in the cells, convincing enough that it took time before guards realized the truth. The men were gone. Sirens wailed, searches began, and the legend of the rock crumbled in a single moment. For the first time, escape from Alcatraz was no longer unthinkable. It was real. The search, the clues, and the silence. The response was immediate. Within hours of discovering the empty cells, the FBI, Coast Guard, and Army Corps of Engineers launched one of the most intense manhunts in American history. Boats circled the waters around Alcatraz, helicopters scoured the bay, and soldiers combed Angel Island, the suspected destination the men might have aimed for. Yet no bodies were found, no definitive tracks on land, and no signs of life. Instead, investigators uncovered fragments. A makeshift paddle washed up near the Golden Gate Bridge. A homemade life jacket surfaced, torn and waterlogged. A sealed waterproof packet containing personal photographs of the Anglin brothers and scraps of addresses floated to shore. These artifacts told investigators that the escapees had indeed reached the water, but what happened after remained unanswered. On June 18th, a week after the breakout, the first alleged message from the fugitives arrived. A postcard addressed to Warden Alcatraz Prison bore the mocking words, "Ha ha, we made it," and was signed Frank Jim Clarence. Each name was written in a different hand. The FBI quickly dismissed it as a hoax, noting that the handwriting didn't convincingly match known samples. But the timing kept the mystery alive, stirring speculation that the men had survived long enough to taunt their captors. The search produced nothing concrete. Warden Olin Blackwell insisted that the bay's currents had swallowed the escapees, while Director J. Edgar Hoover privately urged FBI agents not to reveal too much to the press. "Our job is to find these thugs, not keep them advised of our progress," he wrote in a memo. Officially, the investigation dragged on for 17 years before the FBI closed the case in 1979, concluding that the men had drowned. But even then, doubts remained. The U.S. Marshals Service refused to shut the door. Their files stayed open, wanted posters remained active, and age-progressed images of the three men were released decades later. As retired U.S. Marshal Art Roderick would say, "That case just never goes away." New evidence, letters, and the family's belief. Though the FBI had closed its investigation in 1979, evidence and rumors continued to surface. In 1975, a grainy photograph emerged, allegedly taken in Brazil, showing two men who looked strikingly similar to John and Clarence Anglin. The image was never authenticated, but it circulated quietly among investigators and the Anglin family. To them, it was proof that their brothers had made it. To officials, it was another dead end. Then came the letters. The Anglin family claimed to have received Christmas cards signed by the brothers over the years, though the FBI confiscated them and labeled them inconclusive. In 2013, a new twist shook the story when the San Francisco Police Department received a handwritten letter, allegedly from John Anglin. The author confessed, "I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." The letter claimed Frank Morris had died in 2005, Clarence in 2008, and John himself was terminally ill. He offered to turn himself in if he could receive medical treatment and only 1 year in prison. The FBI analyzed the letter with handwriting, DNA, and fingerprint tests, but the results were frustratingly inconclusive. It was never proven to be authentic, yet never disproven either. When the story was finally made public in 2018, it reignited worldwide interest. People debated whether the confession was a hoax or the closest glimpse of truth the case had ever received. For the Anglin family, the possibility was enough. David Widner, their nephew, spent years collecting documents and even co-wrote a book about the escape. He remembered his uncles as poor boys from Georgia who turned to crime not out of malice, but out of a desire for better things. He described them as resourceful, calling them modern-day MacGyvers. To him, the escape was never a tragedy of drowning men. It was a triumph of ingenuity against impossible odds. But for investigators like Roderick, the lack of closure kept the story suspended between myth and reality. "They either died in the bay or are dead by now," he admitted. Yet the persistence of clues, letters, photos, and whispered sightings kept the case alive in the public imagination. Science, Mythbusters, and AI breaking the legend. For decades, the official stance remained unchanged. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned in the bay, yet science kept chipping away at that certainty. In 2003, the television program Mythbusters recreated the escape using the same tools and conditions: raincoat raft, makeshift paddles, and the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. To the surprise of many, the hosts successfully reached the Marin headlands. Their conclusion was simple: survival was entirely possible. A decade later, in 2014, Dutch scientists from the Delft University of Technology modeled the tides of June 11, 1962. They discovered that if the men had launched their raft between 11 p.m. and midnight, currents could have carried them safely toward the Golden Gate Bridge area. Debris found near Angel Island could even be explained by the tide patterns sweeping fragments back in that direction. For the first time, data supported what the family had insisted for years. The escape was not only daring, it was feasible. Then came the digital age. In 2015, a photograph taken in Brazil decades earlier resurfaced. For years, it was dismissed as too grainy, too uncertain. But in 2020, Irish agency Rothco and U.S. firm IdenTV applied cutting-edge facial recognition technology to the image. Their neural networks, trained on thousands of facial samples, identified the men in the photo as John and Clarence Anglin. While not DNA proof, the analysis gave the strongest technological backing yet to the idea that the brothers had lived into the 1970s. By 2025, the convergence of handwriting analysis, tidal science, and AI facial recognition left the mystery teetering on the edge of resolution. Investigators who had once insisted on the myth of drowning now admitted there was enough evidence to believe the men may have escaped and lived quietly for years. Yet with no bodies, no graves, and no confirmed sightings beyond speculation, the tragedy remains in its uncertainty. They may have beaten the rock, but in doing so, they condemned their story to live forever in shadows. More than 60 years later, the Alcatraz escape still refuses to give us a clean ending. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers remain caught between myth and truth, between freedom and the cold waters of the bay. What do you think? Did they make it to shore, or did the sea claim them forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more mysteries from history, and tap the bell so you never miss what's next.